Hi everyone, I'm Kennedy Casey. I'm a lab manager working with Dr. Marisa Casillas at the University of Chicago. And today I'm going to discuss some of our work looking at English learning children's shift from producing words that are more common in child-directed language, or CDL, to words that are more common in adult-directed language. First, we know that children's vocabulary size increases dramatically across their first few years of life. In just a matter of months, here from 16 to 30, we see that children go from producing very few to hundreds of words. Children's vocabularies first get off the ground, in part with words that are particularly tailored to them. That is, specific word forms or lexical variants that are more common in child-directed language, but less common in adult-directed language. In English, that includes words such as doggy, night-night, and tummy, along with many others that share some common features, such as diminutive suffixes, reduplication, and onomatopoeia. CDL-specific words are overrepresented in children's early vocabularies, but they are eventually replaced by ADL equivalents. However, we do not yet know when this shift happens or how it may be supported or initiated by features of children's early language environments. This type of transition isn't typically captured with standard vocabulary measures, like the CDI or PBBT, which traditionally collapse across lexical variants rather than document them. So in the current work, we rely on spontaneous production data to characterize the relative use, along with the context of use, of CDL versus ADL variants by children and others in their environments. We first determine the timing of the CDL to ADL shift, focusing on children's own productions. And second, we ask about the linguistic information available to children in their everyday language environments that could support this shift. Specifically, we're looking at examples of frequent CDL-ADL word pairs in English, where the two variants can label the same referent. In part 1, we analyze over 60,000 target child utterances for children up to age 7. The bulk of our data come from Childis, which features a mix of different sampling methods, but is primarily cross-sectional. And we've also included speech transcripts from the Language Development Project corpus, collected by Dr. Susan Golden Meadow and colleagues, which is longitudinal rather than cross-sectional. To characterize the timing of the CDL to ADL shift, here we're plotting age in months on the x-axis and the probability of producing an ADL variant on the y-axis. Overall, across children and word pairs, we see, as expected, a significant trend toward increasing production of ADL variants with age. The average transition point, or the age at which children shift from producing primarily CDL variants to primarily ADL variants, is around 2.5 years of age. However, it's worth noting that there's considerable pair level variation, where some pairs like doggy-dog show a much earlier CDL to ADL shift, and other pairs like tummy-stomach show a much later shift. And you can maybe see all the word pairs here. The goal of part 1 was to characterize the overall timing of the shift from CDL to ADL vocabulary. We see that children significantly increase their production of ADL variants with age, and it's worth noting that others in children's environments also do the same. Children's CDL to ADL vocabulary shift could serve to mark their growing knowledge of CDL and ADL as distinct registers, and their emerging awareness of the fact that language should be tailored to the current social interactional context. That is, choosing to label this animal as doggy rather than dog may not communicate anything meaningful about the referent itself, and may more so reflect who is involved in a given interaction. So the next key question is, how do children learn this, especially in cases where most of their input is largely child-directed or coming from a single register? In the second part of our investigation, we explore what types of linguistic information, mostly in children's directed input, could support their shift from CDL to ADL vocabulary. CDL as a register is differentiated from ADL at multiple linguistic levels, including prosodic, lexical, and syntactic. And in this part of our investigation, we ask whether some of the cues that broadly differentiate CDL and ADL at the register level also differentiate the local speech context surrounding CDL versus ADL variants. We use the same speech transcripts as before, now looking at over 70,000 other produced utterances rather than target child utterances, and this time in Childis only because the LDP corpus has not yet been comprehensively time-stamped. This means that we're largely looking at utterances coming from a single register. Over 83% of utterances are from children's primary caregivers, and while addressee information has not yet been annotated for most of the Childis corpora, our impression from manual scanning is that most of these utterances are addressed to the target child. So we're looking for more subtle differences in these linguistic cues for utterances with CDL variants versus ADL variants. And consistent with past research investigating these linguistic cues at the register level, our predictions are as follows. utterances with ADL variants will have a lower mean pitch, narrower pitch range, and will be produced more quickly, so more words per second. They will also be more lexically complex, that is, they will contain more words that are typically learned later in development, and they will contain more rare words or words that are generally infrequent in children's language environments. They'll also be longer or include more words overall, and more verb phrases. Our general analysis structure looks like this. We're asking whether each individual linguistic feature independently predicts whether an utterance will contain a CDL or ADL variant. We also include main effects of an interactions with age, along with random effects for each word pair and speaker. For the main portion of the presentation, I'll focus on just the main effects of each linguistic predictor. Here we're plotting the coefficient estimates on the x-axis, and we found that utterances with ADL variants have lower mean pitch, but not a narrower pitch range. Utterances with ADL words are produced more quickly, so faster speech rates, contain more words with later AOA estimates, contain more rare words, more words overall, and have more verb phrases. So overall, we've seen that CDL and ADL variants co-occur with reliably different patterns of prosodic, lexical, and syntactic information, even in language that we expect to be primarily coming from a single register. These are linguistic cues that could help learners associate CDL and ADL variants with different modes of use or emerging representations of register. A next step is to test this idea experimentally to see whether we can modulate children's expectation of hearing a CDL or ADL variant by manipulating the surrounding linguistic context. But indirect evidence for the idea that children may be exploiting these specific linguistic cues comes from their utterances looking similar to others on these dimensions. So we see that rarity is an especially strong predictor of CDL or ADL appearance in children's own utterances, and the pitch range effect that we didn't see in others' productions was significant for children, and the mean pitch effect was not significant, but was still in the predicted direction. So we find that linguistic cues across multiple levels of representation, prosodic, lexical, and syntactic, may help differentiate utterances with CDL or ADL variants. But our previous models tested each cue individually. However, children actually get all of these cues at the same time in the real world. So in order to check for the relative contribution of each of these features in the CDL-ADL context differentiation, we ran a classifier analysis that included all of these features. Here we used an extreme gradient boosting machine to classify utterances as containing CDL versus ADL variants. Essentially, this type of algorithm combines many different individual decision trees that show pretty weak performance on their own, but adds them together sequentially or boosts them in order to achieve better overall performance. We train the model on 90% of other produced utterances and test performance on the held out 10% set. To evaluate the performance of the classifier, we take into account both the sensitivity and specificity of the model, and we use area under the curve as a measure of accuracy. If the classifier is just performing at chance or is fully random, then the area under the curve would be 0.5. And if we have a perfect classifier, then the area under the curve would be 1. In a model that includes the 7 linguistic input features that I discussed previously, along with age, preliminary results suggest moderate performance in classifying our 10% held out test set, with the area under the curve of 0.73. So overall, this tells us that using this combination of features, we are above chance in predicting whether a given utterance will contain a CDL versus ADL variant. This type of analysis also allows us to determine which features may be the most useful for distinguishing the context surrounding CDL versus ADL variants. And so we can compare the feature or variable importance, which is the average gain in predictive capacity of the model when a given feature is added. Intriguingly, we see here that age is not the most important feature, and overall we see that lexical cues, followed by prosodic cues, may be the most useful for distinguishing the context surrounding CDL versus ADL variants. So in summary, we have shown evidence for a CDL to ADL vocabulary shift in early childhood, as well as evidence to suggest that several of the linguistic features that differentiate CDL and ADL at the register level may also partition the use context of specific CDL and ADL variants. Critically, these findings push us to consider children's vocabulary development not as a simple accumulation of words or a numeric increase in vocabulary size, but rather a deepening and restructuring of the lexicon with growing linguistic and social maturity. These results also highlight the value of studying how words are used in context and how word use changes over development, rather than only seeking to capture when a word is first understood or first produced. Finally, I want to conclude with the recognition that the lexical variants of CDL and ADL registers are just one example of socially meaningful variation in children's everyday language environments. Variation also appears across languages, dialects, and different types of register, so this is motivation to consider that children's lexical knowledge isn't just incrementing on its own, but is instead building around and together with their social knowledge. And lastly, I owe a huge thank you to all of the people who have provided feedback on this work to date, and thank you all for listening.